Welcome back to the Tommy Brideson Show. Now, today I wanted to talk about why you need to use coaching systems within your coaching philosophy. And you need to work and learn from people that also have coaching systems. Now, in training, we need to have ways that we look at things which are going to allow us to get a better outcome. So this can be applied to everything. This can be applied to training technique. This can be applied to training methodologies. This can be applied to long-term progress. Now, I'm just going to use a quick analogy here. If we think of a surgeon, for instance, a surgeon has an objective way that they look at things. They're going to go into a procedure. Say they're doing an operation. They're going to go into a procedure knowing exactly what they need to do in that particular procedure. Now, think about training with that same sort of lens. We want to go into our training technique. We want to go into our training methodologies with an end point in mind, a way that we want to execute these lifts and execute these methods. This is the thing that's going to allow us to get really consistent with our training over time. So let's talk about training technique here. So when we're looking at training technique, what we're looking to do is build towards what we see as ideal. We're not necessarily trying to change someone's technique or change your own technique overnight and turn it into perfect. What we're trying to do is move the dial closer and closer towards what we see as optimal. But what's optimal? So that's where this objectivity comes into it. You need to have a system in a way that you look at it because we're moving the dial closer and closer to this point. So if we're looking at a squat, for instance, and we're thinking about the main linchpins in squatting is your upper back tension, how you create a really nice, strong, rigid brace and how you maintain it, and then how you create tension through the lower body and position your lower body so that you can remain nice and stable and balanced. Now, if you don't have any linchpins or you don't have any outcomes that you link your training technique to, it's very hard to have an objective outcome, or it's very hard to look at your training technique and go, hey, I need to work on X or I need to work on Y. Now, I often speak to my coaching team and I'd say, I would much rather you do something wrong for a consistent period of time, but do it wrong the same way every single time. Because at least then when we start to add in different cueing, or we start to sort of build a little bit of context about where I want you to be in space, you have an objective and a standardized base to work with. So you would much rather be doing something slightly wrong that's consistent than completely changing your technique or adding in a different cue every single time you enter the gym. Now, on that with cueing and changes in your technique and your positioning take time to build and develop. So quite often, even as coaches, we like to give a lot of feedback and we want to get the best out of our clients. But the reality is things take time to develop. If you're working on a positional change, or you're working on a tempo speed change, or you're just reworking sort of like your technique from the ground up, you can't expect it to feel great straight away. So what you need to be is very objective with the way that you approach it and go, okay, well, this is my endpoint and I know what I'm doing now is getting me closer to that endpoint. But without the objective system in place, it's going to be very hard to make those changes. Now, if we move into different sort of training, different type of training sort of methods, if we look at, how you onboard someone into the gym, for instance, you need a consistent way of how you're going to get them into the gym so that you know that you're building certain qualities. And I've spoken about this previously, but, with someone that's coming into the gym, you really want to build them from the ground up. And we call that a bottoms-up approach, where we're really starting to build foundation of technique, build foundation of building muscle mass, capacity, or whatever it is that you're trying to work towards. You're building it from the ground up. You've got these qualities. So you'll have checkpoints along the way for that person that's coming in from the onboarding. Now, if you're looking at someone that's looking to build more muscle mass, we know that as that training program goes on, and the longer that goes, towards the back end of it, we really want to be pushing up the training volume, because volume, time under tension, mechanical stress are really big drivers of adaptation for hypertrophy. So we need to know what those objective markers are. And without a system in place to do so, it makes it very hard and it starts to get a little bit confusing. And then from like a strength standpoint, as we go on through strength, we start off with a little bit more volume and we taper down as the intensity builds up. So without understanding the sort of the structure behind that, you end up sort of just rolling through program by program with no real endpoint, no objective sort of system, the way that you're approaching your particular training. Now, that's looking at the big side of training, right? But then let's have a look at other things like warm-ups. Let's have a look at conditioning programs. Let's have a look at rehab-based programs. If we start at rehab, for instance, we're going to start with the lowest hanging fruit. Say, for instance, you needed to stretch your quad, right? You're not going to start on the most complex version of that quad stretch. You're going to start on a regressed version, and as you get better at it, you're going to move through the coaching system or the rehab system into a more complex exercise. So that means there's room for progression, but you also don't miss anything at the start. If we look at conditioning, if someone is really detrained, deconditioned, and have barely done any sort of aerobic work, I'm not going to throw them into maximal VO2 max, like a 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off type situation, really pushing it like a 9, 10 RPE, because the stress is just going to be too much. You would be better off building a base where you start building some zone 2, build the aerobic base, then you might have the zone 2 work, and then you add in some short intervals, maybe 20 seconds on, 40 seconds off, 5-minute repeat that 3 times with a 1-to-1 rest period. Then you might, in say phase 3 or phase 4, introduce in some of these longer sets where you really start to push the VO2 max. But without having that coaching system in place where you understand the steps of the aerobic conditioning and the base that you should be building at the start, it makes it very hard to progress things. Now, when you have a look at warm-ups, for instance, you might even look at your warm-up programs and go, okay, well, I'm going to start off with looking at isolated muscle groups that I'm going to be using. Say, for instance, I'm bench pressing. I'm going to warm up all the very isolated muscles that are part of that bench press. And then I'm going to progress it as I go on, further and further, more specific down to the actual bench press itself as the training programs go on. But what you can see here is every theme here has a system. So essentially what you need to know are the layers and the steps backwards in most cases. As coaches, we are really good at really dialing in on the thing that we want to be good at. But actually, a superpower that you have is sometimes actually knowing what the steps, the regression steps are, because then you can really build people in to your coaching systems. When you're at the start of a training block, you start them at the very start and then progress them through. But without actually having training systems, an objective way of looking at things in place, you kind of just end up in this floating stage where you're kind of throwing things in and hoping they work, but it is guesswork because you don't really have an objective way of doing it. Now, what you need to start to get yourself towards is a point where all of your coaching decisions, all of your technical changes, all of the methods, everything that you do in your training is based off a system, because then over time, as a collective, you can actually capture that data from your clients and see how they're progressing, see what worked, see what didn't work. And then from the coaching side, that's when you can actually add in and make changes to your coaching systems as a whole. But if you've individually programmed every single person a completely different program that you've just reworked from the bottom up, you're never going to be able to collect enough data either to make any significant changes. So I'm not saying that every single person has to be on the same program, because within each system, you can regress and you can progress through that particular system, but you sort of need to know what are the steps through a hypertrophy program, a conditioning program, a strength-based program, how you would move someone from, through rehab from a very regressed movement pattern into a more complex pattern, and then how you apply this to a bigger whole, to like a long-term training program. Because this is the stuff that really is going to allow you as a coach and a lifter to get real life results that are going to stick. You're never going to be able to not get training progress because you're basing your training off an objective outcome. So, as much as I like the idea of having really personalized training programs, Training programs are personalized to a point, but they all should be based within a system that is progressively getting better and better. So if you speak to any coach that's been around for a long period of time, they would all look back on their training systems from 5 years ago and laugh and be like, wow, how much my coaching systems have progressed in over the last 5 years. But that's a sign of progress. But you never make changes to your training, like your systems, everything at once. You're constantly sort of reviewing it and going, hey, is this improving? Where can I improve on this? There's certain patterns that are popping up. And from that point, you go, okay, great. Now I'm going to input this data and I'm going to see what happens over the next period of time. So, coaching systems are just such a powerful way. Like if you're self-coached or you're working with someone, and look at how the program stacks program by program into one another. The reality is a good training program is something that's very structured, and on paper it looks simple most of the time. But the reality is the complexity of it is actually just the long-term planning and the coaching systems that are inbuilt behind it, behind the scenes that you don't see. The front-facing program itself is quite simple, but there's a lot of nuances in it that make it really, really refined if you were to really break it down. So, that's all I kind of really wanted to sort of go through today was really discuss that, however you're looking at your training program, you want to get to a point where it's objective. You don't want it to be guesswork. You don't want it to be throwing random stimulus in and just hoping that it helps. You want to be basing everything that you do based off, a system or based off in a way that you can at least review it at the end of it and go, was that beneficial or was that not beneficial? So that's it for me today. I'll see you guys on the next episode.